The Rural Community College Initiative, RCCI, is a national demonstration that helps community colleges in distressed regions move their people and communities toward prosperity. It challenges community colleges to become catalysts for economic development and supports aggressive and creative efforts to increase access to education in rural communities. RCCI uses a 9-step planning process called Moving from Vision to Action, developed by MDC Incorporated of Chapel Hill, North Carolina. The steps begin with a rigorous look at data about how the college and the region are doing, then move to development of a shared vision for the future. Teams made up of community and college representatives set 3 to 5 year goals and decide upon concrete strategies for achieving those goals. They determine who needs to be involved and how, and then produce a detailed funding and implementation plan, and a plan for measuring progress toward goals. This video explains moving from vision to action a step at a time. There are clear stop and start points to enable teams to work within each planning step before proceeding to the next.
The Rural Community College process is about changing our colleges and our communities so we can make them better places for the people who live there. And as a way of thinking about what our work is going to be as a team in making those important changes, we want to introduce a model called moving from vision to action. There are a lot of ways of thinking about change, but I think in its simplest and most accessible way, change is about moving from a current situation where we are today to an ideal future that describes how we would like things to be different tomorrow. And your work as leaders in your community and in your college is to both plan and then to lead this process of transformation, of movement from a current situation to a future. From a situation where we have conditions in education and economic development that are not satisfactory, to a state where the performance of the economy and of education systems and the prospects for people are in line with our notions of what a good community and a good college could be. In front of each of you there's a rubber band, so I'm going to ask you to kind of string it between your thumbs, kind of make a suspension bridge, if you will. And think about your left thumb as the current situation and your right thumb as the future, and kind of pull on it. Tell me what you feel when you do that.
Resistance.
Tension.
Resistance.
Elasticity.
Tension.
Flexibility.
Flexibility.
Resilience.
Resilience. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. I think this gives us a sense, if you think about it, we're really building a bridge from today to tomorrow. And our job is to construct a pathway to deal with that resistance that's both flexible and elastic, and then to move ourselves along that pathway. That's the work of planning and leading change. So this is the other metaphor I'm going to encourage you to keep in front of you as you think about our work. Because as we pull on this rubber band, one of the major jobs you're going to have to think about is how far can we stretch ourselves in this work of reforming our colleges and our communities? How far out is that future state? How much different from the current situation can it be? How much stress and tension can our community endure in order to move to a new level? At its core, this work of making change involves an examination and perhaps a shift in values. And I know that as we've done our preliminary work together, many of you have described things that you're not satisfied with in your communities. Many of our communities are characterized by levels of inequality in economic performance, in educational performance. Not everyone has the same opportunity or performs equally well. There is the problem of low performance. Young people and students in our colleges who are not making the grade, low economic performance where wages and opportunities aren't what we'd like to see. And many of our colleges and communities in particular suffer from exclusion, a narrow group of people making decisions without necessarily involving the people who are most affected by the decisions. If these are sort of the values or assumptions or ways of being that characterize our communities today, what the Rural Community College Initiative is about is moving toward a new set of values that underline everything we do. Equity, making sure that everybody has a fair chance to get on the pathway to success. Excellence, universal high standards in education and economic development. I think we all know that for too long rural areas have had a problem, almost a mentality that somehow we may not deserve what other people have. And what we're saying in the Rural Community College Initiative is that it's all right to aim high. In fact, it's necessary to aim high in terms of the kind of economy we want, the kinds of economic opportunities we want, the kind of educational preparation our young people have. And only by moving toward excellence for everyone, excellence and equity together, are we going to build the kind of communities we want. And finally, a critical goal in our rural communities is to move toward inclusion, involving more people in the way we make decisions, really on the premise that the more people who are involved in shaping what the future looks like, the deeper buy-in and the better ideas we'll get about how to move forward.
David, how
Yes.
can we be really inclusive and yet remain a small core team?
That is an excellent question. Pull out your rubber bands, because it's a real tension. It's a very real tension. I think first and foremost, it means looking carefully at how your team is composed. You'll want to make certain that you, of course, have people inside the college and outside the college. But I like to think of it as, how do you cut sort of a diagonal slice through the college and the community so you get people who see the world from the top, a global perspective, but also you involve the people who are most directly affected by the programs and policies of the college. And make sure there's a spectrum, because the same reality looked at from different perspectives can look very different. So I think it means paying attention to what kind of roles and responsibilities do team members bring and represent, and of course looking at gender and ethnic diversity, again to make sure we're seeing the world from as many perspectives as possible. That's really the point, and I'm glad you made that, because in a lot of planning we tend to involve people who either know the issues already or whom we think know the issues. And this effort is a little different. We're asking for a broad-based, inclusive approach to planning, meaning we want to get as many different perspectives into the mix because we think that'll mean a richer reality. And I think that can be done with a team of 8 or 10 people if we choose very carefully who's on the team. It's a great question.
I might also add, and we can come back to this through this session, but there are other places during this Vision to Action planning process where you have a chance of opening the dialogue to wide groups of people. You can host public forums about the data you have found. You can print it in the newspaper. You can decide to organize a special session just to share the draft goals that you've come up with and invite a much wider group there. You can organize focus groups of different kinds of people to get their input on the kinds of data that you're collecting or the kinds of goals that they would see setting.
So in summary, we can think of our work as these two circles, the challenge of moving from current state to future, and also think of it as the job of introducing and living out these 3 core values: equity, excellence, and inclusion. That's really what our work is, to plan a course of action that will help us move from here to there, and to execute that course of action keeping in mind these 3 values as the touchstone of everything we do. That is what our initiative is about. On these foundations, we will erect programs and actions that we can take in economic development and in education. But the basic framework is here in these 2 circles and these 3 values.
Collecting and analyzing data is the first step of the 9 steps of the Moving from Vision to Action process. It's often the toughest part, and often we tend to not want to do it, but it's probably the most important step because it provides us initially with the baseline of information we need to understand what the current situation is that David described. It gives us quantitative information, a very clear picture of what is in our communities, both the challenges and the assets, and allows us to set very clear, measurable, and quantitative goals. A second really important reason for data collection is that once we have the numbers that describe what our community is like and what our college is like, we're able to articulate our concerns to the broader community. Later on, when you've set goals and you've set your action plan and you know what you want to be about and you need to be communicating that to a broader group, selling people on your ideas, motivating others to be engaged in your process, you want to have a very compelling description of what it is you're trying to change. And having good, clear, strong data allows you to do that. A third really important aspect of data collection is that the process of collecting it really builds the skills of people within the college and the broader community at doing this kind of work. All too often, as you well know, we make decisions in our communities, we solve problems without having named the problem. And many of us don't have a really strong comfort level with this aspect of work, with doing hard looking at numbers, understanding what they mean, analyzing them. So doing this work in the Rural Community College Initiative is one of the ways that you're really building institutional and community capacity for problem solving down the line. And a fourth reason is that the process really builds your group. You're going to have a core team grappling with this information, arguing about what it means, trying to come to some conclusion and consensus about the implications of it, and that process will help bring your group together in really powerful ways. You've got in the RCCI a fat data guide that we have suggested that you use to give you some ideas on what kinds of data to look at and how to begin to understand the implications of that data. It'll be important to really spend time with what is in that data guide, and it's broken down really into two sections, one around economic data and one around educational data. And I want to just talk for a couple minutes about the kinds of data that are referenced in that guide, and you know more about this than anyone. But you're going to be looking at data that relates to your economy. Kinds of things you may want to be looking at there are employment data. Who's employed, who's not employed in the community? What's the economic base of the community? What are the strong sectors in the economy that have the potential for growth because they are industries and businesses that bring money into the community? What are the rates of small business formation? How many are starting each year and how are they faring? What are some other kinds of economic data you may want to be spending time gathering and analyzing in your communities?
The types of jobs.
The types of jobs that exist. Good.
I would think that you'd like to see about the success and failure rates of small businesses and
Excellent.
the types of businesses that you have, such as women-owned businesses and home-based type of business
Excellent.
and minority-owned type of business.
Yeah. So you'll want to spend time not just at absolute numbers of new businesses, but try and break that down and disaggregate the information. What are we learning about who's owning these businesses, who's not?
Julie, when I think you take a look at the, when you're taking a look at the economic data, you need to take a look at those unemployment rates. And when you're looking at those unemployment rates for areas like my own, which is on an Indian reservation, you have a couple of different sources for unemployment rates. If you take the state unemployment rate for the reservation, it's somewhere around 40–45%. If you take the BIA figures, it's more like 60%. If you take tribal figures, it's more like 70%.
That's a really excellent point, and it brings in the importance of using what you know as much as you use the numbers that you look at. You want numbers, and you want probably to draw on some experts that can help you with this information, understanding it and interpreting it, drawing on perhaps some of those state resource people. But Ron's point is critical. You all live in these communities, and you know what is really going on. So you need to bring your own common sense and deep understanding of the dynamics of the community's economy and educational system to the conversation. Let's talk for a second about educational kinds of data. You're going to look at things like high school completion rates, college attendance rates from graduating seniors in the community, college attrition rates, how many students are staying in college and making it through. What are some other kinds of things you can imagine looking at here in the educational data process?
You're probably looking at the relationship between the type of programs that you have in regards to the type of jobs that are available or the jobs that need to be looked at. You know, the diversity factor.
Yes. Blas raises a really important point also related to the types of data you're going to want to collect, because I've been talking some about numbers, but you also want to look qualitatively at programs, resources, attitudes about education and the economy as you do all of this work.
Also, I would think that you want to see that if the student in the area of discipline they had in college, is that they're really going to be employed in that same discipline area of discipline once they seek employment, and how successful they are.
Excellent, yeah, which
That
will
will
point
give
you
a
back
good
to, right.
good indication of the program that they matriculated in.
And it'll help look at how the college is doing in terms of a good job preparing students for those occupations and if they're able to succeed.
Another point, it ties exactly what these gentlemen are saying, is that not only are you taking a look at the types of jobs they're going into after they're completing your program, but where are those jobs located? Are they located out of your region? If they are, you're educating people for not community service, not to be staying in your community, not helping your economy. I think that needs to be focused on where are they going after they graduate.
And Ron's point is also really critical in thinking about the integration of these two sections of data collection. You want to be sure you don't get in boxes as you go through this step and think, okay, now we're doing the economy and now we'll do education. These things are completely interrelated, and you need to be paying attention to those dynamics as well. We've written up here also institutional capacities, because one of the things that we've talked about as a goal of the Rural Community College Initiative is building the strength of your colleges as institutions for the long haul in being able to do rural development and building educational access. And so you're going to want to, as you look at data about the college itself and as you look at information about programs that exist in the college and the community, be thinking about what it says about the capacity of the college to be a strong leading institution in the community.
Julie, another point I think we might want to mention in thinking about data is the balance between the time spent collecting it and analyzing it. A lot of groups, I think, have gone overboard in trying to seek out sources, and I think we really here want to urge emphasis on spending time in a dialogue, understanding and debating what the data actually say.
We would recommend using as many existing sources of data as you can get your hands on. Don't spend time looking at raw census numbers. Find them somewhere else, hopefully. And as David says, spend the time on analysis. Look at the information in a disaggregated way. What is it really telling you about who's winning and who's losing in the economy, and who's succeeding and who's not in education? Look, too, at data over time, because this point in time tells you where you are, but you really need to understand where you've been. So look at past data in comparison to the present data and try and look at projections. It's those sorts of things that are part of the making sense of it in the analysis that you really, as David says, want to focus your time on. A couple of other points that we want to just re-emphasize. One is that data can be biased. Ron made the very good point about sources and being careful to use multiple sources of data and not assuming that one source is the be-all, end-all. Data, depending on the source, can have all kinds of biases, and you're well aware of that. And finally, data can really be an important process, back to Marjorie's earlier point, of including other people in this conversation. You want to probably draw on some experts who know a lot about numbers and data, but you also really want to get the voices of other people in the community in this conversation to the extent you can. You may organize focus groups of people who've been through college training programs to find out what they think of them. Interview college students who have dropped out to find out why they dropped out. Those are kind of other sources of data that allow you to get other voices into this conversation that may not be on your core team, but whose voices you really want to hear. So once you've gotten all this data, you want to try and figure out some way to organize it. And we recommend the use of a SWOT framework. SWOT standing for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And many of you have, I'm sure, used this sort of framework in strategic planning before, but strengths and weaknesses are the kinds of information, trends, resources, attitudes, and beliefs that exist inside of the college and the community. They are things that you have some control over. Opportunities and threats are external to your community. They're things like federal legislation, other major global economic trends that you don't have control over, but you need to be aware of. And I suppose finally, you want to remember that facts are friendly. They can be biased, but once you understand the bias and understand the sources and what they're saying, they're a critical part of this process and set you up for goal setting down the line. The second step in the vision to action planning process involves describing the current situation. You have completed the first step, so you have lots of data, and you've got it, we hope, organized in the framework of a SWOT analysis. And we suggest that at this point, you do some initial prioritization and make some decisions about where do we want to focus our energies in this RCCI, and what do we want to have be the basis for the goal setting we're about to undertake. And then you want to use the tool of the T-chart that's in your Vision to Action guide that's here to begin to fill out the left-hand side to come up with a very clear set of statements of the current situation. So we've talked earlier about some ideas of the kinds of data you might be collecting. Floyd was talking about small business success and failure rates and who owns those businesses. What might be an example of a statement of the current situation related to one of those points you made earlier?
Julie, one point that can be made is that there's a 50% failure rate among small business.
Yeah, that would be a perfect, very clear statement of the current situation based on the data.
And of course, we talked about the other types of businesses that people can go into, or we can say that, for example, home-based businesses, that the success rate, it hovers around 80% versus the other side of the coin is that the failure rate is 20%. Those are clear and
good. So you're distinguishing between the kind of typical small business, what we think of small business, and then home-based, much smaller micro businesses, really.
Exactly.
You might have identified 80% success rate or 20% failure rate. Sure. Good. What about on the education side? What might be another example of a current statement?
High dropout rates.
A high dropout rate. That's a very good one, but we'd want you then to quantify that because we're arguing the importance of numbers here as much as possible, where we've got them. So
25% dropout rate at the high school level.
Good. So 25% dropout rate you'd want to put there. Those are excellent examples of the kinds of statements you may come up with.
Julie, I have a question. You've got all these raw data points on the economy and educational kinds of indicators, and now you're talking about prioritization. Well, how does one go about doing that?
Well, you'll do some initial prioritizing to collapse the raw data into some points that you want to turn into clear statements. But you're raising a good point about the need to probably go back and do a second level of prioritization because you're going to have lots and lots of things on the left-hand side of the T-chart, and you're going to look around the table and say, okay, we're in this Rural Community College Initiative. We have a few years and some money and some energy, but how much can we accomplish, and which of these problems do we really want to focus on? So you'll want to probably take another stab at a clearer set of priorities.
I think the point that you were making about the consensus is very critical here because at this point, everybody needs to be reassured that they're part of the team and that as you put the items in a priority that they all feel that they are part of that team and that the outcome of what we're trying to do is going to be a team effort and not just education or just business or the economic development aspect of that.
That is an excellent point to really summarize the importance of this stage. It's so critical to do the data collection and be very clear about the prioritizing that your entire team does because You don't want to go in with a predetermined set of issues that one or two people on the team have been worried about and view this RCCI as a chance to do something about. You want to build consensus. You want to have everybody agreeing that these are the issues we're going to collectively worry about, and be sure that they integrate economic development and educational access concerns.
Step 3 in the vision to action process involves actually creating a vision, by which we mean a word picture of the future that we hope to bring about through our actions. A lot of you I know have done a lot of planning, and often that probably has involved a vision. So let me ask you, why is it important to have a vision statement in a planning process?
So that we are clear on what it is we're working towards, and also will help us to stay focused as we move in the direction.
Great. Clarity,
also helps
focus.
us to see the big picture of what's going on.
Exactly. To be able to see all the ideas encompassed in one statement. Wonderful. What else? Other reasons, other roles the vision
I think it
plays?
also gives us direction.
Wonderful. So what we're talking about in this word picture of what success would look like, of what the world would look like when the values of the RCCI actually get realized, is a statement that will give us a sense of where we're headed, of direction, of unifying the minds and actions of people so we're all on the same path. That really is the purpose of it, and I think for that reason, because of the importance of vision, of that motivating, organizing, unifying, energizing factor, we've named this process moving from vision to action. Defining the current state is absolutely important because, back to our rubber band, it's important to know what we want to transform. But the vision is also important because it defines where we want to go. And as a number of you have said, it's very important for motivating and educating the many publics that we're interacting with in the RCCI to have all of those people who each may see a piece of the RCCI understand how it all fits together. I know when I began to talk and think about these terms, the thing that came first to mind was the idea of foresight. A vision involves looking into the future to try to see what the world could be like if we were successful. Often, I think, this seems kind of like a mystical process, but I think as Julie has helped us see, foresight begins with really understanding the present and inquiring into how the present can be different. So it's less kind of a mystical process than a process of dialogue that's based on and grounded in that data, and in conversations that then say, if this is where we are today, what might the future look like if things could be different? And finally, as Julie has described in talking about kind of trends and the SWOT analysis, peripheral vision. We don't just want to look at a vision for the college. We want to look out beyond the college to the community and say, how do we want our whole universe that we shape and interact in to look different? So keep in mind these three things. A couple of short points on how to go about this. Ideally, we want you to resolve and arrive at a word picture, a word portrait. But how you get to that might involve a number of interactive activities. Some places have actually created a collage, a portrait saying, here's how we hope our community will actually look when the process is successful. Other groups have simply used, again, focus groups and forums to gather ideas from people. This, I think, as we've said, is a perfect place to go public and gather people's ideas and a sense of what they're excited about. So you may want to think of writing something, you may want to think of using arts and music and cultural expression to let people give rise to those ideas of what they hope the future can be. The bottom line here is use this part of the process to be creative. And finally, in summary, when we think about vision, this is what we try to leave you with. Remember that a vision is always based on your values: equity, excellence, inclusion. It's the time to be bold and creative, to stretch that rubber band and paint a bold portrait of the future we want. Have fun in doing it. This ought to be creative and energizing and inclusive and involve as many people in dreaming about how our communities and college could be different. And remember that here really is the place to go public. You want the vision to be able to capture the energies and imaginations not just of the college, but of everyone the college serves. And I think if we remember these 4 points and are bold and have fun, we will create a statement that truly energizes, motivates, and unifies us. Step 4 of the vision to action process involves setting goals. And before we go into an example of that, I want to first define how we like to think of goals. By goals, we mean a description, a quantitatively measurable description of the ends that we want to achieve, of the outcomes that we want to arrive at through our actions. Sometimes we like to think of a goal as our goal is to establish a model tech prep program. That's not what we mean. We don't want to be talking about the actions we're going to take, but rather to talk about the outcomes and ends that we want to achieve, and those ends need to be measurable. The T-chart will help us get to those kinds of measurable, outcome-oriented goals, because the way that we suggest goals get developed is by going back to that T-chart that has our current state on the left-hand side. In the examples, for instance, that we have here, we defined in the current state a couple of benchmarks, measurable statements about the current situation. And our job in setting goals will be to think of the future 3 years out and to ask ourselves, what are going to be the corresponding measurements of success after we have acted and done our reforms over 3 years? So with that, let me ask you to give me an example of a corresponding statement for each of these measurable descriptors of the current state. And as we do it, I'm going to go back to my prop. Remember, this is really the stage where we decide how far are we going to stretch that rubber band. How much change, how much reform can we produce in a 3-year period given our resources, the energy, the commitments, the will, the time that we have at our disposal. So let's say, what's a future indicator? The current situation is 30% of high school students now attend the community college, and of that 30%, 80% require remedial education. What would be a reasonable and stretching goal for 3 years from now?
What if we said that 45% of the high school students would attend the community college?
Great. So we want to increase the number of high school students who attend the community college. And then what about the second piece of that goal? Because we've said 30% attend today and 80% of those attending require remediation. What would be a corresponding goal to say we've made progress on the percentage of students needing remediation? What's a reasonable amount to stretch here?
Let's reduce it down to, say, 50% require remedial education.
50% of that 45%. So let me ask you, team, you're sitting there in your community. Is that enough of a stretch? Is that too much? 3 years? Can you move this up to increase by 15 percentage points the number of students going to the community college and make this dramatic reduction? What do you think?
I think you have to look at your historical data to see if the trend has been there.
Good.
So that you can tie in your goal to the historical data that you've got.
Good. So just don't throw darts at the future. Look and see how much have we been able to do and what's a reasonable rate of improvement. Excellent. Excellent point. Yes?
No, I was just going to mention the fact that, yes, you have to do that, but you have to be realistic by these goals and making sure that they are reasonably attainable.
Exactly.
Because if you do not, that's where frustration comes into play.
Wonderful. The worst thing you want to do is to set a goal that just completely breaks people's ability or will and have 2 or 3 years from now no real sense of progress and the goal appear unattainable. That can that can kill the entire momentum and the entire change effort. What might we say for the economic development goal here? Currently, we have 25 new businesses that open every year, but of those, 80% fail. What would be, again, a reasonable set of targets and outcomes for 3 years from now in economic development?
Maybe we would strive for 40 new businesses opening with a failure rate of 65%.
Good. Yes? Enough stretch? Good, good. So I think you can see from this the process of doing this is really pretty simple. And if we remember these points to keep our goals measurable, precise, denominated in the same kind of data that we have in our current state, we're really achieving a parallelism here and pushing toward that. And the second point would be, as you decide what those benchmarks are, to keep in mind and have a discussion about how far can we reasonably stretch based on what has been our historical performance and also based on the commitment and energy that's beginning to grow from the process.
You mentioned the word commitment, David, and it brings up a point. We also need to maybe look at how much resources are we going to have available to us to reach those goals.
Excellent. And later on in the process, we will do just that. That's a very important point. One of the ways in determining whether or not this is feasible is to have a sense inside ourselves of what resources do we have to work with. At this point, though, what we're really trying to do is establish that other foundation of the bridge. And you're right. As we do that, it's another good reason for having a diverse team. We'll want to keep in our minds what resources do we have to move here. Feasibility, the understanding of feasibility that we all carry around in our brains will also help us determine just how far we can stretch here.
For some of the goals that you set, you're not going to have a number to attach to it, but you want to, again, put something in outcome sort of statement language in terms of the kinds of attitudes you wanted changed, the kinds of programs you want to be different, those sorts of things that can't necessarily be measured, but that are still really legitimate and important goals.
A lot of this activity involves keeping in the back of your mind that general picture of where we want to go, and then making that general picture specific. And you've all captured that, I think, in a number of the things that you've said. Feasibility, again, needs to be a factor in determining how far we push and stretch those benchmarks, because we want to, I think, as Floyd said, make sure our goals motivate and don't frustrate. Exactly. And I think that's the bottom line in goal setting.
You've gotten at this stage in the vision to action process of setting goals, and step 5 involves developing the strategies that you want to implement to achieve those goals. Those can be new programs and initiatives, new educational, informational campaigns to change people's attitudes, any kinds of innovative, new policies, programs, approaches to help you get from the current state to the future state you described. There are 3 aspects of the strategy development and selection process that we recommend that you follow to get to that stage. The first is force field analysis. The second is analyzing and researching your strategies. And third is simply selecting them. The force field analysis is a tool that helps you understand the positive and negative forces that are either helping you work toward your goals in the communities, or that are forces of resistance that are blocking the kind of progress you want to be making. And probably the best way to describe a force field analysis is by illustration. This is a sort of template for a force field analysis that again appears in your Vision to Action guide. And what we've done here is put in the current statement and future statement examples that we were working with earlier. We have a current situation statement of 30% of the high school students in the area attend the local community college and 80% come in requiring remediation. and set a goal to change those numbers to 45% and 50% respectively. Think for a minute in your communities what sorts of forces might be at play working to help you advance toward this goal or working to keep you stuck where you are in the current situation. What are some things going on locally for you, Ron?
Julie, one is for us, we're a relatively new institution, 20 years old, 23 years old. For a number of years we had the problem with high school guidance counselors telling students that we were a second-rate institution, that they should attend a mainstream institution as opposed to the community college.
There's often a real lack of understanding of the importance and value of community colleges, the incredible educational role they play, and that can be pervasive in the community at large, but often very much residing in high school and guidance counselors.
One note on that is it has started to change in the last 4 to 5 years. We're seeing more and more high school students starting to attend the community college.
Good. So this is a negative force, some of the attitudes prevailing among high school faculty, but a positive force is that there are some signs of change with more students beginning to attend the local college. Good. Yeah, Floyd.
You have some community-minded citizens, especially the African-American businessmen and educators who are taking the role of acting as mentors for some young African males to encourage them to stay in school, focus on the education instead of a lot of things about sports.
You've got a basis then to build on of some people involved and committed in the community to support the efforts of linking high school students to the area community college. Great. Yeah. Others?
We also have the issue of oftentimes families do not understand and therefore do not appreciate the value of academic achievement and attainment.
So at home, a resisting force keeping high school students from really going on to secondary education or post-secondary education is the attitudes of families, of their parents and others in the community. So a negative force that has to be dealt with. Good. Any others, Marjorie?
Julie, I think a positive force will be that the jobs of the future are going to require more training and more education.
Absolutely. And people may not be completely aware of it yet, but that's a reality that is a definitely positive force moving people toward the understanding that this sort of change has to happen. Yeah, Ramiro.
I think that we also need to work very closely with the local high schools to develop curriculum that will address the student deficiency, especially in the language development, in the mathematical skills, and the reading comprehension skills.
That's an excellent point, and what you're raising begins to help us think about the kinds of strategies that we may ultimately employ to deal with these forces. Right now there may not be, and maybe that's another negative force, there may not be a very clear connection between the courses that high school students take and what's required to really get into the college and succeed that relates to our remediation goal. So, good.
Right, but they also need to consider if a child or a student needs the remediation, making sure that they channel them into those courses so that when they get to the college level, they are better prepared. Just developing the courses is not going to be enough. They've got to advise and channel them into those courses.
So perhaps a current negative or resisting force is the fact that there's not adequate guidance counseling going on among counselors and teachers in the high school. This is an excellent list, and you can obviously keep going for a while because there are inevitably some others. Perhaps there's state policies at work, state and federal policies, local school board issues. You will want to look at all of these and then begin to say, okay, what does that tell us about the kinds of programs we need to think about developing?
Julie, just a point. I think another reason to do this is because your strategies are going to address your forces. Not, often it's tempting to say, well, our strategies are going to be roadmaps to those goals. They are. But the way you begin to tailor the strategies is to say, how are we going to enhance the positive forces and neutralize the negative ones? So this is really a critical step because it's off of this list of issues that you'll begin to develop strategy ideas.
Strategies can be considered to fall into a number of broad categories, such as informing and publicizing the public, or in the case that we've been talking about, high school counselors and teachers and administrators, Mobilizing people is another broad strategy option. Developing new programs is another broad strategy option. Your Vision to Action Guide describes some of these sort of meta strategies, if you will, that you'll want to be thinking about and relating to the kinds of forces that you've come up with in your force field analysis. And in our case over here, you discussed a lack of understanding on the part of counselors as well as on the part of parents and others in the community about the important link between high school and college. That may indicate a need for some sort of public education campaign or an informational campaign within the high schools. Likewise, you also talked about the weak connections between high school courses and community colleges. That indicates perhaps a program gap. There may not be any strong linking programs that exist in the community at this point that work to connect the high school and the community college in really strong ways. So use this way of thinking to help identify the broad types of strategies that you may want to consider. And then begin a process of brainstorming really specific creative ideas. So if you're thinking about some sort of new program that you want to develop, begin just brainstorming. What could that look like? Where does it need to happen? Who needs to be involved at the table? And get as many good ideas about what the component parts of a new initiative might be as you can possibly get at this stage. Once you're beginning to have shaped an ideal strategy, and in this case you may have some kind of strategy that is setting out to forge really strong ties between high school and college through guidance counselors collaborating, through summer transition programs, any number of things, you'll want to start finding out what the best and smartest ideas are from around the country, even around the globe. And that involves research. It's a part of this process that we typically want to skip over. We generally think we know something that will work. A lot of times we come into this stage having an idea that we want to put on the table that we've been wanting to do for a couple of years. We will encourage you to look beyond where your head is at this stage, beyond the ideas that are already existing in your community, and talk to other people to learn from them about what they have found works in other places. What are some of the places you might think about pursuing to get information about strategies?
Some of the other RCCI community colleges that are participating in the project.
The original 9 pilot sites have all been implementing model efforts, drawing on also really smart thinking from around the country. They've got good ideas, but the 15 of you all coming into this process at this point also have many, many strong efforts that others may want to learn from, so use your peers as a first line, yeah.
Julie, I think we also need to find out from them some things that don't work. And to be aware of the things that haven't worked in our own community so that we don't waste time and waste energy trying to improve things that probably aren't going to work anyway.
You want to ask people, where did you go wrong? And look internally in the community and where have we gone wrong in the past and what hasn't worked and what can we learn from that.
I think that's another reason to have an inclusive team, because the more your team represents a broad number of sectors in the community, the more likely it is that you'll get direct access to that kind of information about what has and hasn't worked. So,
and I think we also need to take in consideration that if we come up with a strategy that has not been tested somewhere else, we're not able to locate any research, we need to keep in mind that, hey, it might be a good idea, that we shouldn't become discouraged just because someone else hasn't done it and someone may have tried and failed in the past.
Absolutely.
And so we need to realize that we can be creative, we can be the pioneers and go out and be the first ones who establish a particular strategy so people can call us in the future.
Absolutely.
Wonderful.
Couldn't be better said.
wonderful.
And the Vision to Action Guide, again, offers you a set of questions you may want to use as criteria for doing that strategy selection. So we'll really recommend that you use that list and add to it, looking at, for example, how does this strategy that we have in mind capitalize on our strengths or build on opportunities? Go back to your SWOT analysis and think about some of those things. Go back to the force field and be sure you're attacking the causes of the problem rather than the symptom. Be sure the strategy ideas you have leverage money and provide a big bang for the buck. You might add to this list of criteria, but be sure that you for each of your strategies, ask yourselves these questions. And if you can't answer yes to most of them, either amend or adapt the strategy or scrap it and say, we'll save this one for later when we can add to it and when we have more time.
This really is the heart of the whole planning process, and just like someone had mentioned before, it allows you to be creative to some degree, and therein lies some of the fun aspects of it. So
that's very helpful, because what we've just described is 3 fairly complex phases of doing strategy development, but the bottom line is that it's about creativity, about invention, and about fun.
We've just talked about strategy development, and in many ways that's about the ideas that we're going to pursue to make our change happen. But the change process is also about politics, as we all know. Getting an idea actually into use involves persuading people, convincing people, giving people incentives to act differently. And it's that level of analysis, understanding what we call the politics of the change process, that we're going to turn to in step 6, using a tool we call stakeholder analysis. This is simple, and this is a lot of fun. It's fun because you really get to name names, and people really enjoy this phase of the work. And it's very simple. You'll see how quickly it goes. Essentially, what you'll do for each strategy is first summarize what that strategy is. And here in our case, we've decided to develop a joint high school-college partnership that will help move more students into the community college and succeed. So once you've got that, what you want to do is think about all of the people and organizations and groups in the community who have a stake in this issue. They may have a stake in seeing this succeed. They may have a stake in seeing that it doesn't succeed. This, and we'll fill this out, I think, just with one example now, is a very powerful way of mapping where you have support, where you have resistance, and it provides a template for then saying, how are we going to help move more of the constituents, a higher percentage of constituents, into these actively helping categories and out of the categories that are negative or apathetic. So let's take an example here. In this strategy, develop a joint high school-college partnership. Who would some of the stakeholders be? Who would be some of the people who'd have a vested interest in this, pro or con?
The high school counselors.
High school counselors. Who else?
College faculty.
College faculty.
The public school systems.
Public school system. How about parents?
Parents, for sure.
How about
students?
Students themselves, maybe employers who see this as a way of developing the workforce of the future.
Admissions.
Admissions people in the, of course, they want to look good. They want to make sure there's a successful pipeline of young people coming into the college. So you can see that this is just simply an act of brainstorming to fill out these groups. Who are the people who have a stake? Now comes the analytic part, and this is again why it's useful to have a diverse team, because your members of your team may very well read the politics of the issue differently. Let's assume a typical community, and what we'd ask at this point would be, of all the high school counselors, what percentage do you think are going to try to stop it from happening, are going to let it happen, are going to help it happen, and are going to make it happen? This is truly an exercise for consensus. But let's see if we can try. Just think about your community. What percentage of high school counselors would want to stop this partnership from happening?
I wouldn't think that any of them would want to stop it from happening, so I would say 0%.
Let's try a 0. We'll go with that. How about?
Extremely optimistic.
I like that. Optimism matters. What percentage do you think would let it happen? Not really before it.
25%.
25%.
It's high, but.
Some nods. No dissenting opinions. So 25% there. By the way, these need to add up to 100%. I think that's self-evident. What percentage do you think would want to help it happen?
50.
50. Yeah. So 25% you're saying are really going to get in there and make it work. Do those look like good odds for success? Or are there too many people in this category, and do we need more people to make it happen? That's the kind of question this kind of chart encourages you to do. And you see, as you go through and fill out this same kind of percentage distribution for each of the stakeholders, what will emerge is a very rich picture of who's with you, who's against you, where your allies lie, and where you can build constituents for change.
And particularly if you find people on the stop it category, you really want to think hard about how do we need to add to our strategy to be sure we're moving them into our camp, or at least being smart about how we implement the strategy so we don't face extreme resistance.
I think the bottom line here is pay attention to politics when you're thinking about your strategies, because failure to do this step could derail a very good idea because of these forces that are at play in every community.
You might find out who you left out.
Excellently.
You know, you look at your boards that have some say-so. You look at the financial institutions that might be part of the mechanism to provide some funds for such an initiative. But you also find some nonprofit organizations that at one time or another have developed a very influential level of participation. And if you leave them out, you know, your program, even though you've done a stake analysis, will end up somewhere in some shelf.
David, since you're talking about having as many people in the category of help it along as opposed to let it or stop it, I think that when we're talking about expanding our team from the core group, that these are the people who we want on our expanded team, the people who are going to be in the help it category or the make it happen category. Those people are the ones we want on our expanded team.
I think that's very true, and each team can choose. Do you want to actually have those people on your expanded team as long-term working members? Do you want to have them on task forces that are about the specific issue that's at play here? Or do you simply want to make sure you reach out affirmatively to those people and solicit their ideas?
And also, I think a lot of times if you get people to become involved, they're less resistant
Absolutely.
to accept change. So you're getting them to buy into the process because they see that they're now a part of the team. They can help to mold the change to fit whatever their circumstances may be.
You understand the politics of change very well. The funding plan that you'll put together is really rather simple in format. It really asks for two principal kinds of information. For the ideas that you propose undertaking, what are the sources of support you're going to bring to that endeavor? First and foremost, you'll have a grant from the Ford Foundation. You also will most likely have in-kind contributions of time and talent from members of your team and from the college. And we will ask you to also look at opportunities to bring in other dollars so you can leverage the impact of that Ford grant, which we like to think of really as venture capital. It's money to test and plant seeds for ideas that you otherwise would not have had. On this category of other dollars, it's useful to think, I think, in terms of two different categories. What can you do to reprogram or redirect dollars that are currently in the college toward the ends and the projects that you're talking about in your RCCI plan? And how can you begin to cultivate and draw in dollars from outside the college, from public or private sources? Your funding plan should also include a list of program costs, and ideally, the support and the costs need to be in alignment. I think that's fairly straightforward and essentially is a budget for the process. The second piece of work in this relates to the long term. Again, we hope and expect that some of the ideas that you've developed are going to show great promise and you'll want to continue and sustain them. So we're asking you to do some thinking on the front end about two dimensions of sustainability. Who's going to own the project and own the component pieces, both in the current term and long term? Where is the institutional home going to lie for these ideas? The college may be the incubator, but it may or may not want to be the long-term manager of some of the ideas you come up. We're also going to ask you to think about sustainability and funding. Where's the current money coming from? And what are potential future funding sources? Again, including, but certainly beyond, the Ford Foundation and the other pilot sources you have. We think that by thinking of these long-term issues on the front end, you can begin in your team to plant the seeds of sustainability rather than at the back end when you've got a great idea and are wondering how to sustain it.
This implies that the kinds of things you're initiating are programs, and as we've discussed, some of the strategies you decide to undertake in the RCCI may not even cost money at this point. They may be just changing certain practices at the college or in the community, but you also want to be thinking about this long-term sustainability question for those things as well, to be sure that the people who are doing those changes of practice continue to get other people engaged in that effort, so if they happen to leave their jobs, the work continues.
I think who's the intellectual owner of the idea, who's really going to make it happen, back to our stakeholders analysis after the initial pilot. I think that's what Julie's talking about. That may involve money, but it also may mean where's the psychological ownership of this effort going to reside? It's a very important question to think about and work toward from the start.
It
Nettie.
would seem to me that if we are effective at the process that we've been talking about today, that the funding, the dollars from outside of the college will come more easily to the project and to the effort.
And back to one of our values of inclusion. The more inclusive we are on the front end, I think the easier it will be both to identify the issues in this plan and actually build towards sustainability from the very start. So again, we're back to our core values, and they serve us well at this stage.
At this stage, you've got a strong group of exciting strategies that you want to implement. You know how you're going to pay for them. You know how you're going to sustain them. And step 8 of the process is to develop a really clear action plan. How on earth are you going to now get all these things done, and who's going to do it? So your action plan answers the questions who, what, when, and how. What's the task? Who's going to do it? When is their work due? When does the task need to be done? And how are they going to do it? Yeah,
Can
Ron.
I interrupt you, ask you a question on this one here? In the what, the when, the how is all pretty much concrete in my mind. It's the who portion of it. What happens when you have the who person is defined as a person who's not either on your core team or your expanded team? Mm-hmm. Do you bring them in then at this point in time and say, this is what we plan for you to do, or do you save it for later and spring it on them? How would you suggest to do this?
I think that's a very good question, and probably you wouldn't want to spring it on them later. I think your point, Ron, is good in that at this stage of action planning, think about who is likely to need to actually do some work on this and invite them to the table. Hopefully they will have heard about the RCCI, they will have been engaged at some stage of the data collection process, perhaps the visioning process, maybe goal setting. They will have heard bits and pieces along the way as this process has unfolded. But yeah, I would suggest there may be several sort of roundtable discussions that you'll want to hold for each strategy and bring in all the players and think about who actually needs to do what and how.
I think also it'd be a lot better if it's a community project to go to some of the sites where part of the initiative is going to take place and try to empower those people that are external to the community college. Not only bring them into the college, but also for us to demonstrate that we have as much a commitment externally outside of the college as them coming to the community college.
Absolutely. And hopefully you will have done that at various points of the process along the way up until this point. A very critical part of being inclusive is to be physically out in other parts of the community, to be present and to be hearing those voices. Yeah, 100%. So you'll want this sort of conversation for each of your strategies, but then you'll also want to step back and say, how do we do this whole thing? We're an RCCI team. We have now all these working groups undertaking these different strategies, and think about how you're going to manage and coordinate the entire effort. Think about here the role of the team leader. Is your team leader going to continue in that role? Are you moving to scenario where you begin to have a paid coordinator for the RCCI. What's the role of the president in overseeing and managing this process? You'll want to think about those sorts of management questions to be sure you have an overall action plan so that implementation really occurs seamlessly. This stage of the process, again, is so important for momentum, because once you've got your proposal submitted to the Ford Foundation, you don't want to just sit back and wait and do nothing for several months as you wait to hear from Ford. You want to begin to dig in and start moving some of these ideas and not lose that momentum that you could really easily lose if you start moving to something else once this is done and wait too long for word from Ford or word from other funding sources. So what we encourage you to do is do action planning and dig into the work right away so that you don't lose any momentum and you head out to begin implementing the exciting ideas that you will have at this point.
You're going to want to track how well you're doing year by year as you progress from your current state to your future state. The evaluation plan really asks you to answer 4 questions. First, what are the indicators, what are the points of evidence we're going to look for that will tell us that we're on track with our strategy of moving from the current state to the future? Second, you'll develop year-by-year benchmarks that are denominated in data that will tell you the measuring points that you should look for in terms of percentage increases, quantitative changes in the current state as you move toward the future state. You'll also want to decide what tools are you going to use to measure those benchmarks and assess your progress. Focus groups, interviews, data analysis, a whole host of tools are open to you, and your evaluation plan should state what those are. And then finally, you'll want to say who is actually going to do this, who's going to conduct the evaluation plan, make it happen. Is it going to be the team as a whole? Is it going to be an institutional development officer inside your college? Is it going to be a community organization? Is it going to be some combination of those? You'll want to do an evaluation plan for each of your goals, not for each of your strategies, but for each of your goals. Because your purpose here is to measure, are we making progress from circle number 1, the current state, towards circle number 2, the future state? And to measure whether or not your multiple strategies are succeeding in moving you from here to there. Let's take a little time now to think about what some indicators might be that you'd want to look at, some points of evidence for our first goal, which you'll remember involves trying to move from a current state where 30% of high school students attend the community college to a future state where 45% of high school students attend the community college, and the corresponding levels of remedial education that are required. What are some of the points of evidence, general categories of evidence that we'd want to examine to give us insights into whether or not we were making success from the current to the future state? Nettie?
Increased enrollment in the college and also increased enrollment in the individual curriculums.
Great. Increased enrollment in the college and in individual key curricula we've identified. Other indicators?
Well, you can further break it down by looking at the demographics as far as by race,
good,
gender groups, and what have you.
Good. So are we getting the right kinds of students
exactly
into the college, and do they match the students we were concerned with on the front end? Very good. Other indicators that we might want to look at?
Reduction in the number of students participating in the remedial experience.
Excellent, excellent. So I think you can see the first step here is to brainstorm what are we going to look at? What are the relevant categories that will that bear examination? After you do that, you're going to want to go back to your T-chart, which again is a 3-year statement of what you hope to change, and simply say, if we began with a current state indicator in year 1 of 30% of high school students attending the community college, and we want to move after 3 years of work to 45%, what sort of annual targets do we want to hit? And again, part of your team's conversation will say, what's reasonable progress after 1 year? What's reasonable progress after 2, after 3? And you'll want to make sure that you're on track to end up in the final year of the future state. Your plan then asks you to, again, include measurement tools and to be clear about who will do it. The reason this is important is not just to satisfy a funder. This plan is useful because if you find you're not on track in moving rapidly enough to your goal, you'll want to do some revisioning. You may want to say, gosh, you know, we made that, we stretched that rubber band too far. We need to pull it back in because we're not going to hit our goal. Or better yet, we didn't stretch nearly far enough, and we found that after 2 years we're at 45%. We can set a new set of goals and push ourselves farther.
Your indicators and your benchmarks need to reflect as much as evaluation of the data as much as resources that you've allocated for the plan that you're working with. Because sometimes the numbers might be increasing at a lot higher than what you had projected, and that might require a shifting of your resources.
Exactly, exactly.
Or the other way around.
Exactly. Good. Excellent point. So use your evaluation indicators as data about how the organization is changing and how the circumstances are changing and how your programs may need to continue to change because you're changing the current reality, and that may have real implications for staffing and resources.
At RCCI, the foundation, we have a temperature thermometer where that it steadily grows, and people monitor that constantly. Fabulous. And they're buying into it and really keeping track of the progress that we're making.
Excellent.
And keeping people informed.
Excellent. So just don't treat this as a private tool for the team. Go public with your benchmarks and celebrate when you achieve them. That's a powerful way to build momentum. So we think if you use this tool together with your action plan, it can be a powerful element in keeping your vision alive and your activities on track.
Let's make a few concluding statements about this vision to action process. We've laid it out in a very straight set of linear steps, 1 through 9, but life does not flow in a linear path, and we understand, and you should understand, that this is a dynamic process. You'll decide to reorder some of these steps. You'll do them in slightly different ways. You'll go back to ones earlier after you've done them, after you have more information later on. So remember that this is more cyclical than it is linear.
But I think keeping in our minds that we're really about helping realize and live out a set of values that are going to result in dramatically changed circumstances for a larger number of people makes us put the steps and the work in context and reminds us why we're really here.
It's something that we know works. We've seen be of great value to people and communities all across the country. But improvise, add to it what you will, what makes sense for your community, your culture, make it work for you, and have fun with it.